The girl stood in this falling snow like she'd been waiting there her whole life. Boots too big, baby bundled against her chest, eyes that didn't beg. Silas Kane stopped on the boardwalk outside Harlan's general store, a sack of flour under one arm. The wind cut through Main Street like a knife through burlap, and the snow was coming down thick now, the kind that meant business, the kind that buried things. She couldn't have been more than 10, 11 at the outside, thin as a fence rail. The baby in her arms was wrapped in what looked like a horse blanket, and steam rose from its tiny mouth with each breath. Her boots, a dead man's boots, too big by half, stuffed with newspaper that was already soaked through, left prints in the snow that looked like wounds. She watched him watching her. "Can you buy us, mister?" Her voice was flat. No hope in it, no fear either. Just a transaction offered, like she was selling eggs or firewood. Silas didn't answer. His jaw worked once, twice, then he turned and walked toward his wagon. He didn't look back. She didn't call after him. The snow kept falling, filling in his boot prints as fast as he made them. 20 paces, 30. The flour sack was heavy on his shoulder. The wind screamed down from the Blackwater peaks, and somewhere behind him, a baby cried, once, then went quiet. Silas stopped. He stood there in the street, snow catching in his beard, one hand on the wagon gate. He didn't turn around. His breath came out white and ragged. 12 years since Emiline. 12 years since the nursery door closed. The wind howled. He turned around. He told himself he turned around because of the weather. The wind was coming. That was all. She hadn't moved. Hadn't shifted her weight. Hadn't pulled the baby closer. Hadn't done any of the things a child ought to do when a grown man walks away and leaves her standing in a storm. She just watched him come back with those flat, measuring eyes. The eyes of someone who'd stopped expecting anything a long time ago. Silas stopped 3 feet from her, close enough to see the blue tinge at her lips, close enough to see the baby wasn't crying anymore, just breathing in shallow little puffs against her chest. "Where's your people?" "Ain't got none." "Your mama? Daddy?" "Dead." She said it the way someone might say Tuesday or potatoes. Just a fact. Trail fever took mama. Daddy went for help. A pause. "He ain't coming back." Silas looked at the sky. The clouds were the color of iron, pressing down low and mean. Another hour, maybe 2, and the road to his ranch would be impassable. He thought about the empty house waiting for him, the silence in it, the door at the end of the hall that he hadn't opened in 12 years. "You got a name?" "Wren." That your brother?" She nodded once. "He got a name?" "Sparrow." Something flickered in her face, almost a challenge. Mama liked birds. Silas grunted. His breath came out in a white plume that the wind snatched away. Behind him, his 2 horses stamped and snorted, their coats already frosted. "Storm's comin'," he said. "Bad one." "I know. You'll freeze out here." "I know that too." He waited for her to ask, to beg, to do something that made sense. She didn't. She just stood there in her dead man's boots, holding her brother like he was the last real thing in the world, and waited for Silas to make his choice. "Damn it all. You're coming with me." He turned toward the wagon, not looking to see if she followed. "Just till the weather clears, that's all." He heard her boots crunch in the snow behind him. 1 step, 2. Then she stopped. "What do you want for it?" He turned. "What?" "Roof, fire, food." She listed them like items on an invoice. "What do you want in trade? I can work. I'm strong enough. I don't eat much. The baby neither. We don't make trouble." Silas stared at her. 11 years old, maybe. Offering herself like a hired hand. Negotiating terms like a lawyer. "I don't want nothing," he said. She didn't believe him. He could see it in the way her shoulders stayed tight, the way her eyes tracked him like he might swing at her any second. But she followed him to the wagon anyway. He lifted her up onto the seat. She weighed nothing, less than a saddle, and she arranged herself at the far edge, as far from him as the bench allowed. The baby stirred once, made a sound like a kitten, then went still again. "He all right?" "He's hungry, but he's all right." Silas clicked his tongue, and the horses started forward. The wagon wheels groaned against the fresh snow. They rode in silence. The road out of Blackwater wound through empty grazing land, past frozen creek beds and skeletal cottonwoods bent by decades of wind. The snow came down harder now, cutting visibility to 50 yards, then 30. Silas kept his eyes forward, his hands steady on the reins. Beside him, the girl didn't shiver, didn't complain, didn't ask how far. She just held her brother and watched the white world slide past like none of it had anything to do with her. Twice, Silas caught himself looking at her boots, men's boots, good leather once, now cracked and salt-stained, the left one patched with what looked like saddle stitching. 2 sizes too big at least. She'd stuffed them with newspaper, but the paper was soaked through, and he could see her toes moving inside, trying to keep blood flowing. He didn't ask where she got them. She didn't offer. The ranch house appeared through the snow like a ghost. Dark stone, steep roof, smoke still rising from the chimney where he'd banked the morning fire. Silas pulled the wagon up close to the porch and jumped down. This is it. She looked at the house, looked at the barn, looked at the cottonwood tree on the eastern rise, its bare branches reaching up like fingers into the gray sky. Her face gave nothing away. Big, she said. Big enough. He reached up to help her down, but she was already moving, swinging her legs over the side, landing in the snow with the baby still secure against her chest. She moved like someone who'd learned not to accept help, like someone who'd learned that hands reaching toward you usually wanted something back. Inside, the house was warm and dark. Silas lit a lamp, and the shadows jumped back into the corners. The girl stood in the doorway, snow melting off her coat onto the plank floor, her eyes doing that measuring thing again, counting exits, he realized, looking for the other doors, the windows, the ways out. There's a room upstairs, he said. Into the hall, clean sheets. Stove in the corner if you want more heat. What about that one? She was looking at the door, halfway down the hall on the left, closed. It was always closed. Storage, Silas said. Ain't nothing in there. She knew he was lying. He could see it in the way her eyes stayed on the door a half second too long, but she didn't push. The room upstairs, he said again. You and the boy can have it long as you're here. And how long is that? Till the storm clears. Day or two, then we'll figure something out. She nodded slowly, shifted the baby on her hip, started for the stairs. Halfway up, she stopped. I ain't asking for charity, she said, not turning around. Whatever you want us to do, we'll do it. I can cook some. Clean, 10 animals. I ain't asking for charity. Silas stood at the bottom of the stairs, one hand on the newel post. The lamplight caught the side of her face, thin, guarded, a bruise yellowing on her cheekbone that he hadn't noticed before. Just stay warm, he said. That's all I'm asking. She didn't believe him. He could tell by the set of her shoulders. But she went up anyway. He heard the bedroom door close, heard the lock click into place from the inside. Silas stood in the empty hall for a long moment. The wind moaned around the corners of the house. Somewhere upstairs, the baby made a small sound. Not crying, just existing, letting the world know it was still there. He looked at the closed door halfway down the hall. 12 years. He turned away and went to bank the fire. She counted the exits before she counted the beds. Old habit. The room was bigger than any place she'd slept in 2 years. A real bed with a real mattress, not straw ticking or bare boards. A window facing east, frost crawling up the glass in patterns that looked almost like writing. A small iron stove in the corner, cold now but laid with kindling and ready to light. Clean sheets. A quilt folded at the foot of the bed, blue and white, hand-stitched, the kind of thing somebody's mother made. Wren stood in the doorway for a long time, Sparrow heavy against her chest, and waited for the catch. There was always a catch. The man downstairs, Kane, the shopkeeper had called him, Silas Kane, owns half the valley, hadn't told her what he wanted yet, but he would. They always did. The nice ones were just slower about it, that's all. They liked to wait until you felt safe, felt grateful, felt like you owed them something, then they told you the price. She crossed to the window and looked out. Snow was still falling, thick and steady, erasing the world. She could see the barn from here, and beyond it the dark shape of a tree on a little rise. A cottonwood, leafless, its branches like black cracks in the white sky. Sparrow stirred against her, made his hungry sound. I know, she whispered. I know, soon. She didn't light the stove, didn't pull back the quilt, didn't sit on the bed. Instead, she lowered herself to the floor in the corner farthest from the door, her back against the wall, and opened her coat to let Sparrow nurse. From the small bottle of milk she'd been keeping warm against her body, it was the last of it. She'd stolen it from a farm 2 days ago, left 3 cents on the porch, all she had, so it wasn't really stealing. That's what she told herself. The milk was thin and bluish, barely enough to fill him, but he drank it like it was the finest thing in the world, his tiny hands clutching at nothing, his eyes closed in something that looked almost like peace. Good boy, she murmured. That's my good boy. When he was done, she burped him against her shoulder and listened to the sounds of the house. Footsteps below, the creak of a chair, the clank of iron, a poker against a grate, banking a fire. Normal sounds, safe sounds. She didn't trust them. She slept sitting up, her back against the wall, Sparrow tucked inside her coat against her chest. Every time the house creaked or the wind gusted, her eyes snapped open, ready, waiting. Sometime in the night, she heard footsteps in the hall outside her door. They stopped, stood there for a long moment. She could see the shadow of boots in the gap beneath the door, backlit by a lamp. Then the footsteps moved away. She didn't sleep again. Morning came gray and cold through the frost-caked window. Wren woke to the smell of coffee and something frying, bacon maybe, or salt pork. Her stomach clenched so hard it hurt. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten anything hot. Sparrow was still asleep, his breath soft and even against her neck. She eased him down onto the folded quilt. She wouldn't use the bed, but the quilt was warm and he needed warm, and crept to the door, listened. Footsteps below, but far away. In the kitchen, probably, the clink of a plate, a chair scraping. She unlocked the door as quietly as she could and slipped into the hall. The house was different in daylight, bigger, cleaner than she'd expected. No dust on the banisters, no cobwebs in the corners. Whoever lived here kept it up, even if he lived alone. There were pictures on the walls going down the stairs. A landscape of mountains, a drawing of horses, a photograph in a gilt frame of... She stopped. A woman. Young, pretty, with dark hair pinned up in a high-collared dress. She wasn't smiling exactly, but there was something soft in her face, something waiting. The kind of face that expected good things to happen. Wren looked at that face for a long time. Then she looked at the closed door halfway down the hall. Storage, he'd said. The lie had been obvious. She filed it away and kept moving. The kitchen was warm, the big iron stove throwing heat into every corner. Silas Kane sat at a long wooden table with his back to the door, a cup of coffee steaming beside his plate. He didn't turn around when she came in, but she saw his shoulders shift, aware of her, even if he didn't show it. "There's food," he said. "On the stove. Help yourself." A skillet of bacon. A pot of oatmeal. A basket of biscuits covered with a cloth. More food than Wren had seen in one place in months. She didn't move. Silas took a sip of his coffee. Still didn't turn around. "It ain't charity," he said, like he'd read her mind. "You're stuck here till the storm breaks. Might as well eat." She approached the stove like it might bite her, took a plate from the stack beside it, served herself a small portion, one biscuit, one strip of bacon, a spoonful of oatmeal. The bare minimum, what she could earn back in work if she had to. She sat at the far end of the table, as far from him as the bench allowed, and ate in small bites, slowly, making it last, tasting every grain of salt, every slick of fat. Her hands were shaking a little, and she pressed them flat against the table so he wouldn't see. Silas finished his coffee and pushed back from the table. He crossed to the window and looked out at the snow still falling, his back to her like a wall. "Storm's gonna last another day at least," he said. "Maybe two." "I figured. You need anything for the baby, you tell me. There's milk in the spring house, fresh from yesterday, blankets in the cedar chest upstairs. All right." He turned then, just enough to look at her over his shoulder. His face was hard to read in the gray light, weathered, closed off, the kind of face that had stopped showing things a long time ago. "You gonna eat more than that?" She looked down at her plate. Half a biscuit left, 2 bites of oatmeal. "I ain't that hungry." They both knew it was a lie, but he didn't push. He just nodded once and turned back to the window. "I got chores in the barn with some," he said. "You don't have to stay in that room. House is yours to move in, long as you're here. Just..." He stopped. His jaw worked. "Just don't go in the door down the hall, the closed one." "Storage," she said. "That's right." He pulled on his coat and hat and went out into the snow. Wren watched him through the window, a dark shape moving toward the barn, shoulders hunched against the wind, disappearing into the white. She looked at the food still warming on the stove, looked at the closed door down the hall, looked at her empty plate. Then she got up and started clearing the dishes. By the time he came back from the barn, 2 hours later, the kitchen was cleaner than it had been in months. Wren had scrubbed the plates in the skillet, wiped down the table, swept the floor, and stacked fresh kindling by the stove. She'd found a broom in the pantry and a rag under the sink, and she'd worked without stopping. Without resting, Sparrow propped in a basket she'd lined with a dish towel and set where she could see him. Silas stood in the doorway, snow melting off his coat, and looked at what she'd done. "You didn't have to do that." "I know." She wrung out the rag over the sink, not looking at him. "Needed doing, though." He opened his mouth like he was going to argue, then closed it again, nodded slowly, hung up his coat. "Baby doing all right?" "He's fine. Found the milk like you said. He took a good feed." "Good." Silence. The fire crackled in the stove. Outside, the wind had died down some. Still snowing, but gentler now, the flakes falling straight instead of sideways. Silas crossed to the counter where she'd stacked the clean plates, picked one up, turned it over in his hands like he was inspecting her work. Then he set it down and looked at her. Really looked, for the first time since she'd come downstairs. "How old are you?" 12. The lie came easy. She was 11, but 12 sounded more useful. "Old enough to work." 12, he repeated. Something moved in his face, a shadow, there and gone. "That's too young to be alone." "I ain't alone. I got Sparrow." He didn't answer, just stood there with his hands at his sides, looking at her like she was a problem he didn't know how to solve. In the basket, Sparrow made a sound, not a cry, something softer, almost a laugh. They both turned to look at him. He was waving his tiny fists at nothing, his face scrunched up in that expression babies make when they're trying to figure out the world. Something happened to Silas's face then, just for a second, like a door cracking open and light leaking through. Then it closed again, and he turned away. "Storm will break by tomorrow," he said, his voice rough. "Day after at the latest. We'll figure things out then." He walked out of the kitchen without looking back. Wren watched him go. Then she looked down at Sparrow, still waving his fists, still making his small, happy sounds at the ceiling. "Don't get comfortable," she whispered to him. "We ain't staying." But even as she said it, she could feel the warmth of the stove at her back, the fullness in her belly, the roof solid above her head. She picked up the broom and went back to sweeping. That afternoon, there was a knock at the door. Wren froze mid-step on the stairs, Sparrow in her arms. Below, she heard Silas's boots cross the floor, heard the door creak open. "Ruth," his voice flat. "Storm ain't stopped you, I see." "Storm never stopped me yet, Silas Kane, and you know it." A woman's voice, warm and sharp at the same time. "I brought some things. Figured you might need—" Silence. Wren could imagine the woman's face, catching sight of something unexpected. Silas. The warmth was gone now, replaced by something careful. "Who's that on your stairs?" Wren came down slowly, one step at a time. The woman in the doorway was maybe 60, broad-shouldered, with gray hair pulled back tight, and a face that looked like it had seen everything twice and forgiven half of it. She was holding a basket covered with a checkered cloth, and her eyes were sharp as broken glass. "This is Wren," Silas said. "And her brother. They're staying till the storm passes." Ruth Harlan didn't say anything for a long moment. She looked at Wren, looked at the baby, looked at the way Wren held him, protective, practiced, the way someone holds the only thing they can't afford to lose. Then she looked at Silas, and something passed between them that Wren couldn't read. "Well," Ruth said finally. She stepped inside and set the basket on the table. "I brought extra, just in case. Bread, some preserves, bit of ham." She looked at Wren again, and her voice softened. "You hungry, child?" Wren didn't answer. Ruth turned to Silas. Emiline would have liked her. The name hit the room like a stone dropped in still water. Silas's whole body went rigid. "Don't," he said. "Silas, don't." Ruth pressed her lips together, nodded once. She looked at Wren with something that might have been pity, or might have been understanding, hard to tell which. "You need anything," she said. "You send for me. Harlan's General Store. Anyone in town can point you." Then she was gone, leaving nothing behind but the basket on the table and the name hanging in the air like smoke. Wren stood at the bottom of the stairs, Sparrow quiet against her chest. Silas hadn't moved. He was staring at the door Ruth had closed behind her, his hands clenched at his sides. "Who's Emiline?" He flinched like she'd struck him. "Nobody," he said. "She's nobody." "Oh." He walked past her without another word and disappeared into the back of the house. A moment later, she heard a door close. Not the forbidden one. His bedroom, maybe. Or somewhere else a man could go to be alone with whatever was eating him alive. Wren looked at the basket Ruth had left, looked at the photograph on the wall, the young woman with the soft face and the waiting eyes. Emiline. She filed the name away with the locked door, and the way his face had cracked open when Sparrow laughed. Then she went to see what was in the basket. She caught him staring at her boots. He looked away too fast. 3 days now. The storm had gentled to a steady snowfall, then to flurries, then to a cold so sharp it hurt to breathe. The road to town was still buried under 4 feet of white, and Silas said it would be another 2 days at least before the county sent a plow through. Maybe longer. Wren didn't mind. She told herself she didn't mind. The days had taken on a rhythm. She woke before dawn, fed Sparrow, came downstairs to find coffee already made and food warming on the stove. She ate, more now than that first morning, though still less than he put out, and then she worked. Swept the floors, beat the rugs, scrubbed the pots, fed the chickens in the small coop behind the house, scattering grain with hands that shook from cold while Sparrow watched from the basket she carried everywhere. Silas didn't tell her to do any of it, didn't thank her either. But she caught him noticing, the way his eyes tracked the clean windows, the fresh stacked kindling, the order she was building out of his bachelor chaos. He noticed, and he didn't stop her, and that was enough. That was the deal, even if neither of them had spoken it aloud. But the boots. He kept looking at the boots. It was mid-morning, the 4th day, and Wren was kneeling by the fireplace in the main room, coaxing the embers back to life. Sparrow was in his basket nearby, gnawing on a wooden spoon she'd given him to teeth on. Silas sat in the big chair by the window, mending a bridle, his hands moving with the ease of long practice. "Where'd you get them boots?" Wren's hands stilled on the poker. She didn't turn around. Found him. Found him where? On the trail. Somebody left him. Silence. She could feel him looking at her back, weighing her words like a man weighing coins to check for counterfeits. They're too big for you, he said finally. They keep me standing. She heard him shift in his chair, the creak of leather, then nothing. When she finally turned around, he was looking at the bridle. In his hands again. His face closed off and unreadable. But there was something in the set of his jaw, not suspicion exactly, something softer, something that looked almost like concern. She went back to building the fire. That night, after supper, he asked about her mother. They were sitting at the kitchen table, him with his coffee, her with a cup of milk she'd finally stopped refusing. And the question came out of nowhere, dropped into the silence, like a stone, into a well. What was she like? Your mama. Wren wrapped both hands around her cup, felt the warmth seep into her palms. On the floor beside her, Sparrow was asleep in his basket, his breathing soft and even. She sang, Wren said, all the time, songs I didn't know the words to. Old songs, she said, from her grandmother's grandmother. She paused. She had a voice like... She stopped, swallowed. Like what? Like something you'd want to follow, even if it was leading you somewhere bad. Wren stared at her milk. Daddy always said that's what got him, her voice. Said he heard her singing in a church in Missouri and followed her all the way to the altar. Silas was quiet for a moment. Sounds like he loved her. He did. The word came out flat, hard, for a while. She didn't say more. Didn't explain what happened after, the drinking, the debts, the way love could curdle into something that smelled like whiskey and tasted like fear. Silas didn't ask. He just sat there with his coffee going cold, looking at her with those eyes that saw too much. The trail fever, he said. When she passed, you were alone? Had Sparrow. That ain't what I asked. Said Wren lifted her chin. I had Sparrow, and I had these. She pointed at her own two hands. That's all anyone's got in the end. What they can do and who they got to do it for. Something moved in Silas's face. That door cracking open again. Just a sliver. How long you been on your own? Since she died? 7 months? Maybe 8? She'd lost track somewhere in there. The days blurring into a long smear of cold and hunger and putting one foot in front of the other because stopping meant dying. We walked from Nebraska, caught a ride with a freight wagon for a while. Then she stopped. Then what? Then we walked some more. It wasn't a lie, not exactly. But it wasn't the truth either, not the whole truth. Not the part about her daddy coming back with a man and a bottle and a handshake that sold his children like livestock. Not the part about what she'd done to get free. Silas watched her for a long moment. She could feel him at the edge of the question, deciding whether to push. He didn't. Nebraska to Wyoming, he said instead. That's a long walk. Didn't have much choice. No, he said quietly. I don't suppose you did. Silence settled over them again. But it was different now. Softer, like a blanket instead of a wall. Sparrow stirred in his basket, made a small sound, then settled again. Silas's eyes went to him, that flicker again, that crack of light, and then away. He's a good baby, Silas said. Hardly cries. He learned not to. Wren's voice was matter-of-fact. Crying draws attention. Attention ain't always good. Silas flinched. Just slightly, just for a second, but she saw it. How old is he? 10 months. 11 next week. She looked down at her brother's sleeping face. He won't remember none of this. The trail, the cold, Mama. Her throat tightened. That's good, I think. Better not to remember. Maybe. Silas's voice was rough. Or maybe remembering's the only way to hold on to what mattered. Wren looked up at him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. You're thinking about her, Wren said. The woman in the photograph. Emiline. His whole body went still. Mrs. Harlan said her name, Wren continued, her voice careful. And you looked like I hit you with a shovel. That ain't your concern. I know. She held his gaze. But you asked about my mama. Seems only fair. Silas sat very still for a long time. The fire crackled in the stove. The wind had picked up outside, rattling the windows in their frames. But inside the kitchen it was warm, warm in a way that had nothing to do with the fire. She was my wife, he said finally. His voice was quiet, stripped of everything but the words. Emiline, 12 years ago. Wren waited. She died having our baby, a girl. Little thing, no bigger than your brother there. He paused. His hands were flat on the table, and she could see a fine tremor running through them. Baby lived 3 days, then she went too. I'm sorry. Don't be. The words came out harsh, automatic. Then he shook his head. No, I don't mean it like that. I just mean, he trailed off, started again. People say sorry, and it don't change nothing. Don't bring 'em back. Don't make the house less empty. No, Wren said. You all said don't. They looked at each other across the table. A man who'd lost everything 12 years ago, and a girl who'd never had anything to lose except a brother and a pair of dead man's boots. Two different kinds of alone. Two different kinds of surviving. The door, Wren said quietly. The one you said was storage. Silas's jaw tightened. That's where they were. The nursery. He didn't answer. But he didn't deny it either. You ain't been in there since. No. Why? Because... He stopped. His voice cracked on the word, and he looked away, toward the dark window and the snow falling beyond it. Because if I open that door, they're really gone. Long as it stays closed, there's still, I don't know, a piece of it that's still alive. A piece of her. Wren thought about that. Thought about her mother's voice, the songs she used to sing, the way Wren sometimes woke up in the middle of the night still hearing them. That ain't how it works, she said softly. Keeping a door closed don't keep nobody alive. It just keeps you locked out of your own house. Silas turned back to her. His eyes were wet, though no tears fell. You're 11 years old, Yemme, he said. What the hell do you know about it? 12, she corrected. And I know because I tried it after Mama died. I kept her shawl in my pack, and I wouldn't open the pack because if I didn't look at it, maybe she wasn't really gone. She paused. Then the shawl got stolen, and she was still gone. And I didn't even have the shawl anymore. Silas stared at her. So that's what I know, Wren said. She pushed back from the table and stood. Holding on to closed doors don't bring back the dead. It just makes sure you can't use the room. She picked up Sparrow's basket and headed for the stairs. Wren. She stopped but didn't turn around. Thank you, Silas said. His voice was rough, barely above a whisper. For telling me about your mama. She stood there for a moment, her back to him, the weight of Sparrow warm in her arms. Every winter's hard, she said, but they end. Then she went upstairs and left him alone with his cold coffee and his closed door and the snow falling silent outside the window. Later that night, when the house was dark and still, Silas walked to Wren's door. He stood outside it for a long moment, listening to the soft sounds of sleep within. Then he knelt down, quietly, carefully, and held a piece of string against the floorboard where he'd seen her boot print earlier, marking the length with his thumbnail. He didn't knock, didn't say anything. Just measured, then folded the string into his pocket and walked back downstairs. In the morning, he would ride to town. Ruth would have boots, small ones, the right size. He'd tell her they were for a neighbor's kid. Ruth wouldn't believe him. But she wouldn't ask either. That was the deal. That had always been the deal. The mayor came with a smile and a question. Is that child legal, Silas? It was the 6th day. The road had finally cleared enough for travel, and Silas had gone to town at first light. For supplies, he'd said. For things they needed. He didn't mention the string in his pocket or the errand at Ruth's store. Wren had watched him go from the upstairs window, Sparrow on her hip, and felt something twist in her chest that she didn't have a name for. Not fear exactly. Something worse. Hope. She'd spent the morning trying to kill it, swept the floors twice, scrubbed the pots until they gleamed, fed the chickens, collected eggs, stacked wood by the back door. Work was safe. Work was a transaction. Work didn't ask you to trust anything except your own 2 hands. But the hope kept creeping back. The way he'd looked at her last night, after she'd told him about closed doors. The way his voice had cracked on his wife's name. The way Sparrow had laughed at breakfast and Silas hadn't looked away this time. Had watched with something soft and broken in his face, something that looked almost like hunger. Don't, she told herself. Don't you dare. She was upstairs changing Sparrow's rags when she heard the wagon. Too soon. Silas had only been gone 2 hours, and town was an hour each way. She crossed to the window and looked out. 2 wagons. One was Silas's. The other belonged to someone else. A black carriage with brass fittings, the kind that cost more than most folks earned in a year. 2 men sat in the front, one holding the reins, one sitting straight-backed with a dark coat and a hat that gleamed like oil. Wren's blood went cold. She knew that kind of man. Knew the way they held themselves, the way they smiled, the way they looked at people like her. Not as people at all, but as problems to be solved, obstacles to be removed. She grabbed Sparrow and backed away from the window. Downstairs, voices. Silas's, low and tight, another man's, smooth as butter on a hot knife. Just a few questions, that's all. Nothing to get worked up about. I ain't worked up, Bellamy. I'm busy. There's a difference. Of course. But you understand, the town has concerns. A man of your standing, taking in strays, people talk. Let him talk. Silas. The smooth voice hardened, just a little. There's a child in your house. A child no one knows. No papers, no family, no history anyone can verify. Surely you can see how that looks. Wren crept to the top of the stairs, Sparrow clutched tight against her chest. She could see them now, Silas standing in the doorway, blocking entry, and beyond him 2 men, one thick and tired-looking with a star on his chest, the other tall and lean with silver hair and eyes like creek ice. The silver-haired man was doing the talking, Mayor Bellamy. She'd heard the name in town, those first desperate days. Richest man in the valley, owns the bank, owns half the town council. Don't cross him unless you want your life made hard. She's a child, Silas said. Her and her brother. They needed shelter. I gave it, that's all. And very Christian of you, I'm sure. Bellamy's smile didn't reach his eyes. But there are complications. The sheriff here has been making inquiries. It seems there was some trouble down south. A man found dead on the trail near Horse Creek, throat cut, his belongings stolen. Wren stopped breathing.
That ain't got nothing to do with his boots were taken, Silas.
Bellamy's voice was soft now, almost gentle. Fine leather boots, too big for most folks. Distinctive stitching on the left one. A patch, looked like saddle work. He paused. You wouldn't happen to have noticed anything like that, would you? Silence. Wren could see Silas's back, the rigid line of his shoulders. Could see him not turning around, not looking up the stairs, where she stood frozen with her brother in her arms and her heart slamming against her ribs. I don't know what you're talking about, Silas said. No? Bellamy leaned to the side, looking past Silas into the house. His eyes traveled up the stairs. Found her. Ah, he said. There she is. Wren didn't move. Couldn't move. She felt like a rabbit caught in the open, a hawk's shadow falling over her. Bellamy's smile widened. Those are fine boots you're wearing, child. Mind telling us where you got them? She found them. Silas's voice was hard. On the trail, that's what she told me. Found them. Bellamy nodded slowly, his eyes still locked on Wren. On the trail, near a dead man, perhaps? A man with his throat opened up and his pockets turned out. She's 11 years old. 12. Wren heard herself say. Her voice sounded strange, distant, like it belonged to someone else. I'm 12. 12, then. Bellamy's smile didn't waver. Old enough to hold a knife, I'd say. Old enough to know what a man's boots are worth in winter. That's enough. Silas stepped forward, putting himself between Bellamy and the stairs. You got accusations to make, you make 'em to me. You want to arrest someone, you arrest me, but you leave her out of it. Silas, the sheriff spoke for the first time, his voice weary. Nobody's arresting anybody, we're just asking questions. Then ask 'em and get out. Bellamy raised both hands in a gesture of peace. Of course, of course. We're all friends here. He looked past Silas again, up the stairs to where Wren stood trembling. But I'd think carefully, if I were you, both of you, about what stories you tell and what boots you wear. Because the truth has a way of coming out, doesn't it? And when it does... He let the sentence hang. We'll be in touch, he said to Silas. Give my regards to the little ones. Then he turned and walked back to his carriage, the sheriff trailing behind him like a tired dog. Silas stood in the doorway until both wagons had pulled away, until the sound of wheels on snow faded to nothing. Then he closed the door and turned around. His face was pale, his hands were shaking. But his eyes were the worst part, because they weren't angry. They weren't even scared. They were asking. Wren! She couldn't move, couldn't speak. Sparrow squirmed against her chest, picking up on her fear, starting to fuss. Wren. Silas took a step toward the stairs. I need you to tell me the truth. I found them. The words came out too fast, tumbling over each other. I found them on the trail, just like I said. I wouldn't... The truth. His voice cracked on the word. Please. And there it was. That word she'd never heard him use before. Please. Not a demand, not a command, a request. He was asking her to trust him. She couldn't. She'd trusted before. Trusted her daddy when he said he was going for help. Trusted the man who bought them when he said he'd take care of them. Trust was a door you opened and couldn't close again. And whatever came through it was your own fault for letting it in. I can't, she whispered. Wren, I can't. She turned and ran. Up the stairs, down the hall, into the room that had almost started to feel like hers. She grabbed her coat, the thin, patched one she'd come in with, and wrapped Sparrow in the blanket from the bed. The window faced east. Below it, a porch roof. Below that, snow. She'd jumped from higher. Wren! Met Silas's boots on the stairs, coming fast. Wren, wait! She didn't wait. She pushed open the window, climbed out onto the porch roof, and dropped into the white below. The cold hit her like a fist. She stumbled, caught herself, started running. Behind her, she heard Silas shouting her name, but the wind snatched the sound away. The storm was over, but another one was starting, and this time, she was the one who ran. The blizzard swallowed her in 3 breaths. By the 4th, Silas couldn't see the porch. He'd come out the front door running, coatless, calling her name into the white. The wind threw it back at him like a slap. Snow drove sideways, stinging his face, filling his eyes, turning the world into a howling blank. Wren! Nothing. The wind and the snow and the cold that cut through his shirt like it wasn't there. He ran back inside, grabbed his coat, his hat, his gloves, grabbed the lantern from the hook by the door. Though he knew it would be useless in this, the flame would blow out in seconds, and even if it didn't, the light wouldn't cut more than a foot through the swirling white. He grabbed it anyway. Wren! He staggered off the porch and into the storm, one arm raised against the wind. The snow was already knee-deep and drifting, and he could feel the cold seeping through his boots, his trousers settling into his bones like something that planned to stay. She was out here. An 11-year-old girl, 12, she'd said, but he knew a lie when he heard one. In a coat too thin for autumn, let alone a Wyoming blizzard, carrying a baby, running from the only warmth she'd known in months because he'd asked her for the truth. Because you pushed, a voice whispered in his head. Because you couldn't let it alone. He'd seen her face when Bellamy mentioned the boots, seen the blood drain out of her, seen her go still, the way a deer goes still when it hears the rifle cock. She'd been terrified, not of Bellamy, not of the sheriff, of him, of what he'd think when he knew. And what did he think? What did he think about an 11-year-old girl who'd maybe killed a man and stolen his boots and walked 500 miles in them to stand in the snow outside his store and ask to be bought? He thought she was the bravest damn person he'd ever met. He thought she was a child who'd done what she had to do to survive. He thought if he didn't find her in the next hour, she'd be dead, and so would her brother, and the last thing she'd have known was that she couldn't trust him. Wren! The wind screamed back. He searched for 2 hours, maybe 3. Time lost its meaning in the white. There was only the next step, the next drift, the next lungful of frozen air that burned going down. He covered the ground between the house and the barn and the chicken coop, the coop in the creek bed. He called her name until his voice cracked and gave out, and then he kept calling in a ragged whisper that the wind stole before it left his lips. Nothing. She was gone. Swallowed up, like Emiline, like the baby, like everyone he'd ever... No. He wouldn't let it end like this. Not again. Not with another grave under the cottonwood, another door to lock, another 12 years of silence and cold. The cottonwood. He stopped, turned, tried to get his bearings in the swirling white. The tree was on the eastern rise, maybe a quarter mile from the house. Emiline had loved it, said it was the first thing she'd seen when they rode up to look at the property, and she'd known right then that this was home. He'd buried her there, and the baby beside her, in a plot he'd fenced with iron rails and planted with wildflowers that came up every spring whether he tended them or not. Why would Wren go there? She wouldn't. She didn't know what it was. To her, it was just a tree on a hill, a dark shape against the gray sky. But something in his gut told him to look. He turned east and started climbing. He found her at the base of the cottonwood, curled around her brother like a shell around a seed. She wasn't moving. Silas dropped to his knees beside her, his heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his teeth. Snow had drifted over her legs, her back, one side of her face. Her eyes were closed. Her lips were blue. Wren. Nothing. He pulled off his glove and pressed 2 fingers to her throat. For a terrible, endless moment, he felt nothing. Just cold skin, still and waxy. Then, a pulse, faint, thready, but there. Oh, thank God. The words came out broken, more sob than speech. Thank God, thank God! He brushed the snow from her face, her hair. Her eyes fluttered but didn't open. In her arms, Sparrow stirred. He was warmer than she was. She'd wrapped him in everything she had, given him her coat, her body heat, her life if she had to. She was ready to die for him, Silas thought. She was ready to freeze to death under a stranger's tree to keep her brother warm. He gathered her up, both of them, the girl and the baby, and started back toward the house. The walk back was the longest of his life. She was heavier than she looked, or maybe he was weaker than he thought. The snow dragged at his legs, the wind shoved at his back, and twice he stumbled and nearly went down. But he kept moving, one step, another. By the time he reached the porch, he couldn't feel his hands. He kicked the door open and carried them inside, into the warmth, into the light. Ruth was there. He'd forgotten he'd sent for her before he left, asked her to come help while he was in town. And she took one look at the bundle in his arms and went pale. Lord have mercy, is she alive? Silas's voice was raw, scraped clean. Barely. We need to warm her. Slow, not too fast, or I know how to treat frostbite, Silas Kane.
But, yeah.
Ruth was already moving, pulling blankets from the chest, stoking the fire, putting water on to heat. Get those wet clothes off her. I'll take the baby. Silas laid Wren on the rug by the fire. Her eyes were still closed, but her breathing was stronger now. Shallow, ragged, but steady. He pulled off her coat, thin, useless thing, and her boots. The boots. He held them in his hands for a moment. Dead man's boots. Evidence, Bellamy had called them. Proof of something terrible. He set them aside and kept working. She woke fighting. One moment she was still, pale and cold under the pile of blankets Ruth had heaped on her, and the next she was thrashing, screaming, her small fists swinging at nothing and everything. Let me go! Let me go! Silas caught her wrists, held them firm but gentle, the way you'd hold a spooked horse. Wren, stop. You're safe. I ain't yours. She was crying now, tears streaming down her face, her voice cracking on every word. I ain't nobody's. You can't keep me. You can't buy me. I ain't trying to buy you. Then what do you want? The question hit him like a punch, because it was the same question she'd asked that first night. What do you want for this? And he still didn't have an answer she'd believe. I want you to be warm, he said. That's all. I want you and your brother to be safe. Why? Because his voice broke. He let go of her wrists, sat back on his heels. Ruth had taken Sparrow into the kitchen, and he could hear her singing softly to him, an old hymn about rivers and rest. Outside, the wind had died down, and the snow was falling straight now, quiet and steady. Because nobody should have to stand in the snow and ask to be bought, he said. Nobody. Not a child. Not anyone. Wren stared at him. Her chest heaved with ragged breaths. Her face was blotchy from crying, her lips still tinged with blue. He sold us, she whispered. Silas went very still. My daddy. The words came out in a rush now, tumbling over each other like water over rocks. He came back. After Mama died, he came back. But he wasn't alone. There was a man with him. A man with money and a wagon with a cage in it. Her voice dropped to nothing. He sold us for whiskey. His own children. For whiskey. Ruth had stopped singing in the kitchen. The man who bought us, he said we'd work for him, said we'd earn our keep. Wren's hands were shaking. But I saw the way he looked at me. The way he... She stopped, swallowed. I knew what he wanted, so that night, when he was sleeping, I took his knife, and She couldn't finish. She didn't have to. Silas sat there in the firelight, looking at this girl, this child, who had done something terrible and necessary to save herself and her brother, who had walked 500 miles in a dead man's boots because they were all she had, who had asked to be bought because she'd learned that everything had a price, even safety, even kindness. How old were you? He asked quietly. 9. 9 years old. The same age his daughter would have been if she'd lived. Wren. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away. She didn't. He rested his hand on her shoulder, carefully, gently, like she was made of something that might break. What you did, that wasn't wrong. That was surviving. That was protecting your brother. I killed a man. You killed a monster who bought children. His voice was steady now, surer than it had been in 12 years. That ain't murder. That's justice. She looked up at him. Her eyes were wet, red-rimmed, full of something he recognized. Hope, the kind that hurts. You ain't gonna send me away? No. You ain't gonna tell the sheriff? No. Why? Her voice cracked. Why do you even care? Silas thought about Emiline, about the baby who'd lived 3 days and died in his arms, about the nursery door he'd kept locked for 12 years because opening it meant admitting they were really gone. Because I had a daughter once, he said. She didn't make it, and I've been punishing myself ever since. Locking doors, shutting people out, telling myself I didn't deserve. He stopped, took a breath. But you walked up to me in the snow and asked if I'd buy you. And God help me, Wren. I think you're the first person in 12 years who's made me want to open that door again. She stared at him. Then she broke. Not like before, not fighting, not screaming. She just crumbled. Fell forward against his chest and sobbed like the child she'd never been allowed to be. Great heaving sobs that shook her whole body, that soaked through his shirt, that sounded like something tearing loose after being held too long. Silas wrapped his arms around her. He didn't tell her it was okay. It wasn't okay. None of it was okay. Not what her father had done. Not what she'd had to do to survive. Not the years of cold and hunger and fear. But she was here. She was alive. And for the first time in 12 years, so was he. In the kitchen doorway, Ruth Harlan stood with Sparrow in her arms and tears running down her face. Outside, the snow kept falling. Quiet now. Gentle. Like something finally letting go. He opened the nursery door. For the first time in 12 years, the dust didn't move. Nothing did. It was past midnight. Wren and Sparrow were asleep by the fire, wrapped in every blanket Ruth had been able to find. Ruth herself had gone home an hour ago, after making him promise, 3 times, that he'd send for her if anything changed. The storm had gentled to a whisper, and the road to town would be passable by morning, when Bellamy would come back, when the questions would start again, when he'd have to decide what kind of man he was going to be. But that was morning. This was now. Silas stood in the doorway of the nursery, one hand on the frame, and looked at what he'd locked away. The room was smaller than he remembered. Strange how memory made things bigger. The crib, the rocking chair, the window facing east. In his mind, this room had grown into something vast and terrible, a mausoleum of everything he'd lost. But it was just a room, 10 feet by 12, whitewashed walls gone gray with dust, a window with frost on the glass. And in the corner, the cradle. He'd made it himself. Spent 3 months on it, working nights after Emiline went to bed, sanding the wood smooth as river stone, carving little birds along the headboard because she'd said once that she wanted their children to dream of flying. He'd finished it a week before the baby came. Set it right there, under the window, where the morning light would fall across it soft and golden. The baby had slept in it exactly twice. Silas crossed the room slowly, his boots loud on the bare floor. The dust rose around his ankles like smoke. He stopped in front of the cradle and looked down at it, the carved birds, the tiny mattress still dressed with the blanket Emiline had quilted, the hollow where a child should have been. "Hey, little one." His voice came out rough, broken. "Daddy's here. I know it's been a while." He reached down and touched the blanket. It was cold. Everything was cold. "I'm sorry I stayed away. I'm sorry I—" He stopped. His throat had closed up, and for a long moment he couldn't speak at all. He just stood there with his hand on the blanket, feeling the weight of 12 years pressing down on him like snow. "I thought if I kept the door closed, you'd still be here somehow, like you were just sleeping. Like if I didn't look, I didn't have to know for sure." He laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Stupid, ain't it? Keeping a door closed don't keep nobody alive. A little girl told me that, 11 years old, and she knows more about living than I learned in 47 years. The wind murmured against the window. The frost had thickened, turning the glass into a field of white feathers. She lost her mama, too. And her daddy was worse than losing. He sold her, sweetheart. Sold his own children like they were cattle. And she survived. 9 years old, and she did what she had to do to keep her brother safe." He sat down in the rocking chair. It creaked under his weight, the first sound it had made in over a decade. "She reminds me of you. Not how you looked. We never got to see how you'd look. All grown, but how you might have been. Strong, stubborn, too smart for your own good." He paused. "She's got your mama's eyes, not the color. The way they look at things, like they're seeing all the way through to the truth." He rocked slowly, the chair creaking its old familiar rhythm. Outside, the snow had stopped. The clouds were thinning, and somewhere behind them, stars were starting to show through. "I couldn't save you," he said quietly. "I couldn't save your mama. I held you both, and I watched you go, and there wasn't a damn thing I could do about it. And I've been so angry, sweetheart. So angry at God, at the world, at myself. Angry enough to close every door and lock every window and tell myself I didn't need anyone, didn't want anyone, was better off alone." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, head bowed. "But I was wrong. Being alone ain't strength. It's just a slower way of dying." The words hung in the air. He could feel them settling into the room, into the dust, into the silence that had lived here for 12 years. "There's a little girl downstairs who needs a home. Her and her brother. And I know, taking them in won't bring you back, won't fix what's broken, won't make up for the years I wasted being angry and cold and closed off." And he lifted his head, looked at the empty cradle. "But maybe that ain't the point. Maybe the point is just being there, showing up, doing what you can with what you got." He stood slowly. His knees ached. When had that started? And his back was stiff from the hours in the cold. But there was something else too, something lighter, like a rope that had been wound too tight for too long, was finally starting to loosen. "I'm going to take care of her," he said. "Her and Sparrow. I'm going to give them a home, and I'm going to keep them safe. And I'm not going to let anyone, not Bellamy, not the sheriff, not anyone, take that away from them." He crossed back to the doorway, stopped, looked over his shoulder at the room one more time. "I love you," he said. "Both of you. That ain't ever going to change. But I think maybe it's time to let the door stay open." From when he left it open when he walked away. Downstairs, the fire had burned low. Wren was still asleep on the rug. Sparrow curled against her chest, both of them breathing slow and even. The firelight caught the edges of her face, softening the sharp lines, making her look younger, 11 years old, the same age his daughter would have been. Silas lowered himself into the chair by the fire and watched them sleep. His mind was quiet for the first time in as long as he could remember. No voices telling him he wasn't enough. No ghosts rattling the doors he'd tried to keep closed. Just the crackle of the embers and the soft sound of breathing in the snow silence outside. He thought about tomorrow. Bellamy would come. The sheriff would come. There would be questions, accusations, demands. They'd want to take her away, to an orphanage, to a cell, to anywhere that wasn't here. He wouldn't let them. He didn't know how yet, didn't know what it would cost. But he knew, with a certainty that felt like bedrock, that he would stand between that girl and anyone who tried to hurt her, even if it meant losing everything, even if it meant burning down the life he'd built. Some things were worth more than safety. Some people were worth more than comfort. What if I ain't enough? He'd asked Ruth. Maybe he wasn't. Maybe he'd fail. Maybe tomorrow would bring a reckoning he couldn't win, but at least he'd try. At least he'd stop walking away. Near dawn, Wren stirred. Silas was still in the chair, half asleep when he heard her voice. Small, rough with sleep. You're still here. He opened his eyes. She was looking at him over Sparrow's head, her face half shadowed by the dying fire. Where else would I be? She didn't answer, just watched him with those eyes that saw too much. I opened the nursery, he said quietly. Left the door open. Something shifted in her face. Why? Because a smart little girl told me that holding on to closed doors don't bring back the dead, just keeps you locked out of your own house. Wren was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, so soft he almost didn't hear it. Every winter's hard. Yeah, he nodded slowly. But they end. She almost smiled. It was small, fragile, barely there at all, but it was real. Outside, the first gray light of dawn was creeping across the snow. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crowed. A new day, whatever it brought. The town was waiting for him. They'd made their decision. He was about to make his. Silas rode into Blackwater just after 9 in the morning, the snow crunching under his horse's hooves, his breath fogging in the cold air. The sky was the color of old iron, heavy and low, but the storm had passed, and the world was still, that particular stillness that comes after a blizzard, when everything is buried and quiet and waiting to see what survives. He'd left Wren and Sparrow with Ruth. Hadn't told them where he was going, only that he'd be back before nightfall. Wren had watched him from the window as he saddled the horse, her face unreadable, Sparrow in her arms. She hadn't asked him to stay, hadn't asked him anything at all. But when he'd looked back just before he turned onto the main road, she'd lifted one hand, just slightly, just enough. He'd lifted his in return. Now here he was, Main Street. The general store, the saloon, the bank, the church, all of it familiar, all of it strange. He'd ridden this street 1,000 times over 30 years, and it had never felt like enemy territory before. It did now. There were people on the boardwalks, more than usual for a Tuesday morning, ranchers in heavy coats, shopkeepers in aprons, women with baskets, and children at their heels. They stopped when they saw him, stopped and stared, and whispered to each other behind cupped hands. Word traveled fast in a small town. Bellamy had made sure of that. Silas dismounted in front of the church, tied his horse to the rail, took a breath of cold air that burned his lungs. Then he walked toward the town hall. The meeting was already in progress when he pushed through the doors. It was standing room only, 30, 40 people crammed into a space meant for half that. Bellamy was at the front, behind the long table that served as a council desk, his silver hair gleaming in the lamplight. Sheriff Aldridge sat beside him, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Pastor Webb was there too, and Doc Hensley, and a handful of other faces Silas recognized from church, in the general store, and the cattle auctions. They all turned when the door opened. Bellamy's smile was the first thing Silas saw. That smooth, oiled smile that never reached his eyes. Silas. Bellamy spread his hands in a gesture of welcome. So glad you could join us. We were just discussing the situation. I figured. Silas walked down the center aisle, boots loud on the wooden floor. People shifted aside to let him pass, their whispers dying into silence. Thought I'd save you the trouble of coming to me. How considerate. Bellamy gestured to an empty chair near the front. Please, sit. We have much to discuss. Silas didn't sit. He stopped at the front of the room, facing Bellamy across the table, and planted his feet like he was bracing for a storm. I ain't here to discuss, he said. I'm here to tell you how it's gonna be. A murmur ran through the crowd. Bellamy's smile flickered, just for a second, then returned, sharper now. Is that so? That's so. Silas looked around the room, meeting eyes, letting them see him. I know what you've been saying. I know the stories you've been spreading. A child killer, you're calling her, a murderer, a danger to the community. Those aren't stories, Silas. Bellamy's voice hardened. Those are facts. A man is dead, his throat was cut, and his belongings were stolen. And that girl is 11 years old. The words fell into the room like stones into water. Ripples of reaction, gasps, whispers, shuffling feet. 11 years old, Silas repeated. And do you know why she killed that man, Horace? Do you know what he did to deserve it? Bellamy's jaw tightened. That's not... He bought her. Silas's voice was steady, but there was iron underneath it now. Her and her baby brother. Bought them from their own father for a bottle of whiskey, and God knows what else. And he wasn't planning to put them to work in a field, if you take my meaning. Silence. Dead, ringing silence. She was 9 years old when it happened. 9. She did what any of you would have done, what any of you should have done, to protect herself and her brother from a monster. He looked at Bellamy, held his gaze. So you want to call her a murderer? You want to drag her off to some orphanage or some jail cell? You go right ahead and try, but you're going to have to go through me first. Bellamy recovered faster than Silas expected. The smile came back, thinner now, more knife than welcome. A touching story, he said. If it's true. But we have only the girl's word for any of it. No witnesses. No proof. Just the claims of a child who, by your own admission, has already killed once. And I'm vouching for her. You. Bellamy let the word hang in the air. A man who's known her, what, a week? A man who's been living alone so long he's forgotten how to be part of a community? I ain't forgotten nothing. Haven't you? Bellamy leaned forward, his voice dropping to something almost intimate. 12 years, Silas. 12 years since Emiline. 12 years of locked doors and empty chairs, and not a word to anyone about what you're feeling. And now, suddenly, you want us to believe you've found a purpose. That this stray child is somehow your redemption? The word hit harder than it should have. Redemption. Like Bellamy could see right through him, see all the broken pieces he'd been trying to put back together. But that was the thing about broken pieces. Sometimes they fit together in new ways. Maybe she is, Silas said quietly. Maybe that's exactly what she is. And maybe that's none of your goddamn business. It's the town's business when... No. Silas's voice cut it through like a blade. It ain't. She's a child who needs a home. And I'm giving her one. That's between me and her and God, and it don't concern you or the sheriff or anyone else in this room. He turned to face the crowd. The faces looking back at him were mixed. Some hostile, some uncertain, some carefully blank, but a few were different. Ruth Harlan, standing near the back, her chin lifted and her eyes fierce. Doc Hensley, nodding slowly like he was working through a problem. Old Mrs. Patterson from the feed store, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. I know most of you, Silas said. Known you for 30 years, worked beside you, buried your dead. Helped when the winters were hard and the cattle were dying and there wasn't enough to go around. He paused. I ain't asking for anything I wouldn't give. I'm just asking you to let me do what's right. Let me give that girl and her brother a home. Let me be the father I never got to be. Silence. Then Ruth stepped forward. Her voice rang out clear and strong. I'll vouch for her too, and for Silas. Anyone who knows him, really knows him, knows he's the most decent man in this valley. If he says the girl deserves a chance, then she deserves a chance. Ruth, Bellamy started. I ain't finished. Ruth fixed him with a look that could have curdled milk. You've been pushing for Silas's water rights for 3 years, Horace. Don't think we all don't know it. And now suddenly you're concerned about the welfare of children? She shook her head. Sit down and stop embarrassing yourself. A ripple of something, not quite laughter, but close, ran through the crowd. Doc Hensley stood up. I'll vouch for them too. Then Pastor Webb, slowly, reluctantly, as will I. Then others, one by one, standing up, speaking out. Not everyone. Bellamy still had his allies, his debtors, his dependents, but enough, more than enough. Bellamy's face had gone the color of old ash. He looked around the room, counting votes, seeing the balance shift. This isn't over, he said quietly. The law, Sheriff Aldridge interrupted, speaking for the first time, ain't interested in prosecuting a 9-year-old girl for defending herself against a child buyer. He sighed heavily and pushed back from the table. I've got better things to do with my time, Horace, and so do you. He picked up his hat and walked out. The meeting dissolved after that. People milling around, talking in low voices, shooting glances at Silas that ranged from sympathetic to curious to grudgingly respectful. Bellamy sat alone at the council table, his silver hair gleaming, his face a mask of controlled fury. Silas didn't gloat, didn't even look at him. He just walked out into the cold morning light, mounted his horse, and rode home. She was waiting on the porch when he came up the road. Wren stood there in her thin coat, He'd have to get her a proper one. Add it to the list. With Sparrow on her hip and her face tight with worry, Ruth was behind her in the doorway, one hand on the girl's shoulder. Silas dismounted, walked up the steps, stopped in front of her. "Well?" Wren's voice was barely a whisper. "What happened?" He looked at her, this fierce, frightened, unbreakable child who'd walked 500 miles in a dead man's boots and asked to be bought because she didn't know any other way to ask for help. "You're staying," he said. "Both of you, long as you want." She stared at him. Her lip trembled. "That ain't—" Her voice cracked. "That ain't charity?" "No." He shook his head slowly. "That ain't charity, Wren. That's family." She didn't cry. Didn't throw herself at him. Didn't do any of the things a child in a story might do. She just nodded once, swallowed hard, and said very quietly, "Okay." But when he put his hand on her shoulder, she didn't pull away, and that was enough. The morning light came through the nursery window for the first time in 12 years. The baby was sleeping in the cradle. Wren stood in the doorway, watching Sparrow's chest rise and fall beneath the quilted blanket, Emiline's blanket, the one with the blue and white stitching and the small imperfections that meant someone's hands had made it with love. The cradle rocked gently, moved by a draft from the window or maybe by something else, something that didn't need explaining. The room wasn't dusty anymore. She'd cleaned it herself 2 days ago while Silas was out with the horses, hadn't asked permission, hadn't explained. Just taken a rag and a bucket and scrubbed until the windows let the light in again, and the floorboards shone, and the little carved birds on the cradle's headboard looked like they might actually fly. Silas hadn't said anything when he saw it, just stood in the doorway for a long time, his jaw working, his eyes wet. Then he'd nodded once and walked away. That was how they talked now. In silences and nods, and small acts that said more than words ever could. She came downstairs slowly, one hand on the banister, her feet quiet on the steps. The house was warm. Silas had been up before dawn, stoking the fires, putting coffee on, doing all the small things that kept a home alive. She could hear him in the kitchen now, the scrape of a chair, the clink of a cup. She was wearing the new boots. They fit perfectly. Soft leather, good stitching, sized exactly right, like someone had measured her feet without her knowing. She'd found them outside her door 3 days ago, wrapped in brown paper with no note. She'd known immediately who they were from. Known, too, that he'd never admit it if she asked. She hadn't asked. The old boots, the dead man's boots, the ones she'd walked 500 miles in, the ones that had kept her standing when standing was all she had, were on the porch. She'd put them there this morning, side by side, toes pointing out toward the road. She didn't know why. It just felt right, like leaving a marker, like saying goodbye to the girl who'd worn them. That girl was still part of her, would always be part of her, but she didn't have to be all of her. Not anymore. Silas was at the kitchen table when she came in, a cup of coffee cooling in his hands, his eyes on the window where the sun was just starting to clear the eastern ridge. The light caught the gray in his beard, the lines around his eyes, the weathered landscape of a face that had seen too much and survived it anyway. He looked up when she entered, looked at her boots. Something moved in his face, there and gone, quick as a heartbeat. "Morning," he said. "Morning." She crossed to the stove, poured herself a cup of milk from the pot warming there, and sat down at the table. Not at the far end anymore. Closer now. Close enough to reach across and touch his hand if she wanted to. She didn't. Not yet. But the distance was different. The oil lamp sat on the table between them, unlit. The sun was bright enough now that they didn't need it, but it was there. The same lamp that had been burning in the window the night he'd brought her home. The same lamp she'd watched him light a dozen times in the days since. "I'll do it," she said. Silas looked at her. "Do what?" She reached for the matches, struck one, touched it to the wick. The flame caught and held steady and warm, pushing back shadows that weren't there anymore. Silas watched her do it, didn't say anything, but his eyes said everything. They sat in the quiet for a while, the lamp burning between them, the coffee cooling, the morning light filling the kitchen with the kind of gold that only comes after hard winters. Outside, the snow was starting to melt, dripping from the eaves, settling into the earth, making way for whatever came next. "I saw the boots," Silas said finally, "on the porch. Yeah. You don't want them anymore?" Wren looked at her hands, small hands, a child's hands, hands that had done terrible things and gentle things and everything in between. "They got me here," she said slowly. "That's what they were for, getting me here." She paused, "But I don't need 'em to stay." Silas nodded, took a sip of his coffee, set the cup down. "Wren." She looked up. His face was open in a way she'd never seen before. All the walls down, all the doors unlocked, nothing hidden. He looked like a man who'd been carrying something heavy for a very long time, and had finally set it down. "I want you to know he said, "that whatever happens next, whatever comes, you got a place here. You and Sparrow. Not because I need something from you, not because you owe me anything, just because—" He stopped, cleared his throat. "Just because you belong here. If you want to." Ren felt something shift in her chest. Something that had been locked tight for years, since before her mother died, since before her father walked away, since before she learned that love was a door people walked through and never came back. "You didn't buy us," she said. Her voice came out quiet, barely above a whisper, but the words filled the room like light. "You didn't buy us, mister." She held his gaze. "You just gave us somewhere to stay." Silas looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were wet, but he didn't look away, didn't hide. "Reckon I did," he said softly. Outside, a bird called. The first one she'd heard since the storms began. Somewhere in the distance, water was running, snow becoming stream, becoming river, becoming something new. "Weather's turnin'," Silas said. Ren almost smiled. It was small, fragile, like the first green shoot pushing through frozen ground. It always does. Later, she went out to the porch to watch the sun climb higher. The old boots were still there, side by side, the newspaper stuffing visible through the worn leather. She looked at them for a long time, remembering the weight of them, the way they'd rubbed her heels raw, the miles and miles they'd carried her through. Then she looked down at her feet, at the new boots, soft and warm, and exactly her size. Behind her, the door opened. Silas came out and stood beside her, his shoulder almost touching hers. They didn't speak, didn't need to. They just stood there together, watching the snow melt and the light grow and the world wake up from its long, cold sleep. In the house behind them, Sparrow laughed. The sound drifted out through the open door, bright and clear and full of something that sounded like joy, like hope, like the beginning of a story instead of the end of one. Ren turned to look at Silas. He was already looking at her. "I think he likes it here," she said. "Yeah." Silas's voice was rough, but there was warmth underneath it now. A warmth that hadn't been there before. "I think maybe he ain't the only one." She didn't answer, didn't need to. She just stood there in her new boots, on the porch of the house that was becoming home, and let the morning light fall across her face like a promise, like a prayer answered, like grace,